Yes, my name's Stuart Crawford. I'm a former Army officer and former political lobbyist. And for the last 20 years, maybe the last 30 years, I've had great interest and done a lot of study and writing into how an independent Scotland might go about defending itself, set up its armed forces, and to a certain extent how it would finance them. And so that's been a major interest for some time now. And it's one should never claim to be an expert in anything, but it's a field in which there are very few competitors. So expert in a field of one, perhaps. Well, I joined, dates first of all, I joined the Army in 1980, but it wasn't a sort of straightforward transition from school, university into being a soldier. I don't come from a military background, although my father had done a 2-year short service commission as his national service in 1946, and ended up in the Highland Light Infantry, which was the Glasgow and Ayrshire Regiment, and I'm basically from Glasgow. Although sometimes people say I don't sound like it anymore, which is a huge insult. But I'm basically from Glasgow, and I was under no pressure. Some people are interested in train spotting, some people are interested in bird watching. For reasons that I can't explain, I was always interested in military history, soldiering, and particularly tanks. And I had absolutely no background knowledge of them whatsoever, except I was interested, and I did the usual, small boy stuff. You had the Airfix models, and usually you made a hash of the first 3, and then you got better at it. And anyway, so that was that. I didn't join the cadet force at school. I wasn't in the officer training corps at university, but I always had a hankering to do what my dad had done and go to Sandhurst and be an army officer, and also to be in a tank regiment. But being a sort of typical west coast of Scotland Presbyterian boy, as part and parcel of my degree, it transpired that I could become a chartered surveyor if I did 2 years practical sort of competency. So I came out of university and did that for 2 years so I'd have a job to fall back on. And how familiar does that sound to everybody? And then the day I qualified, I applied to go to join the Army as an Army officer, knowing absolutely nothing about it. But anyway, I ended up, I went and did all the bits and bobs, did the regular commissions board, passed that, got to Sandhurst, absolutely hated it, joined a Scottish tank regiment, 4th Royal Tank Regiment, sadly disbanded, and it was just the most wonderful experience. One enduring memory would always be the interaction with the soldiers that I had the great good fortune to lead and command. And we always called them the boys, and we still call them the boys because we're all still in touch. The fact that we're all in our late 60s and 70s doesn't seem to matter. It's just, the boys say this and the boys say that. In fact, I was talking to some of my fellow former officers on a Zoom chat, and we just talk about the boys as if they're still 18 and 19. But I really got on well with them. They, at least I think I got on well. You'd have to ask them whether they got on well with me. But the repartee and banter, and they were basically mainly from Glasgow, with a smattering from Fife, and then a few from way beyond the hills, up north, all called MacLeod for some unknown reason. But I really, really enjoyed the interaction with them, and I can just remember laughing and laughing and laughing. Although sometimes the work was actually quite hard. So that's one abiding memory. The other abiding memory is going out to the first Gulf War, which came as a huge surprise to me because I'd just got married about 3 weeks beforehand. And I was sort of pinged to go out, not as part of one of the fighting brigades or regiments, but actually into the headquarters, which was in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. And the way the military works is always amusing, because when I was told I was going, they said, "Oh yes, you're going to the headquarters in Jeddah." And of course, when I turned up and landed, it was Riyadh. I thought, well, I'm in the wrong place. But in fact, they'd got it wrong. It wasn't Jeddah. It was Riyadh. But that was really interesting. That's the only time really I've been in any sort of conflict. It wasn't dangerous for me. We did get scud raided, I think, 16 times. I've written a wee book about it, which is now out of print, so I can't persuade anyone to buy it anymore. But it was a very small book. And that was a fascinating experience, and one that I'll never forget, because lots and lots of people never actually get to put into practice what they've trained for many, many years. Well, I mean, I think there was always a sort of thread of Scottish independence streak in my family. When I was growing up, I came from a classic nuclear family. Parents who met at university and stayed together until they passed on. And I and my sister, classic sort of square family. But I think my mum, who I was hugely influenced by in many ways, she always had a streak of independence. She was very compassionate, and she was a great champion of the underdog. My father was a wee bit more sort of conservative in his political outlook, and I couldn't really place him anywhere. I mean, he wasn't in any way anti-independence, he just wasn't actively for it. But I probably picked that up from my mother, that streak, and then it sort of waxed and waned, and it's quite difficult to be political when you're a serving army officer, although it did get me into trouble towards the end of my time, which I can expand on at some point. But I just became interested. I just saw the way the wind was blowing, and I sort of looked at it from afar, and I was probably stationed in Germany at the time, and just reading the newspapers when they came through a day late and thinking, oh, something's going on in Scotland. And so, to a certain extent, I engineered my military career and my postings to get a posting back to Scotland, to be in the thick of it. And I just got drawn in. I joined the SNP because I'd written something about defence, and one of the SNP activists at the time, a chap called Colin Campbell, I was knocked at my door and said, "We're interested in what you're writing. Would you be interested in joining the SNP?" And I thought, well, yes. No one's ever asked me to join a political party before. So I had lots of interesting things. I was vetted. In fact, I had an interview with Mike Russell, who was the chief executive at the time, in the Arts Club in Bath Street in Glasgow. And obviously I got the tick. And so I became more and more involved. But I was always interested in the defence side of it, really. Yeah, well, I mean, I first came back. I came back to Scotland first of all to do something called a Defence Fellowship, and that's basically a Ministry of Defence funded research fellowship. And I was teaching. I was on I was a member of the directing staff, or basically teaching at the Army Staff College, which was then in Camberley in Surrey. And I thought this is quite a good springboard to do a Defence Fellowship, which I'd always wanted to do, not because I don't consider myself to be hugely academic, but because I was always interested in the sort of academic side of military stuff. So I managed to get through the selection process for Defence Fellowship, and they only give 2 a year, and I chose to do mine in Glasgow. And it's a self-initiated, sort of self-chosen subject matter, and I chose to study race relations inside the British Army. And I had a travel budget. I had access to everybody and anybody I wanted to go to, and all credit to the Ministry of Defence for allowing that sort of thing to happen. So I went and interviewed politicians. I interviewed the Commission for Racial Equality. I went out to Australia and saw how they did it. I visited Greater Manchester Police. I found out how they were dealing with it, because at the time, lots and lots of people had studied why people from sort of BAME backgrounds were not being recruited. And there was lots of stuff, but no one was actually studying what actually happened to those people who were recruited and how it panned out. And of course, this is very topical nowadays. Well, anyway, so I did all that, and I found all the stuff out, and I knew when I'd finished my sort of report, which was 40,000 words, I knew that it was just going to disappear without trace, because it didn't say things that the Ministry of Defence would want it to say, because that was perfect. It was an academic study, I was being honest. So I thought, I'll send my copy off to the Ministry of Defence. They'll say, thank you very much, now your next posting is X. So I thought, how do I get this out into the world, and yet not lose my job? And I thought, well, what I'll do is I'll follow the academic convention of sending a copy of your work to the people you've consulted, which is actually just good manners if you think about it. So I did that, and so I'd interviewed Ming Campbell, John Reid, who later went on to become Secretary of State for Defence, and lots of other people. And that was it. So I sent it out, and I thought, well, I can do no more. And I was sitting at my desk doing whatever job I was doing in Edinburgh at the time, and the phone rang one day, and this sort of disembodied voice from down south in the MOD said, "Are you aware that your Defence Fellowship report is being debated in the House of Lords at the moment?" And I said, "I've got absolutely no idea." And they said, "Well, did you leak it?" And I said, "No." Anyway, the end result was that I was interviewed under caution by the Special Investigations Branch of the Royal Military Police because they thought that I might be politically motivated, which actually I wasn't at all. So it got me into trouble. There is no in-house experience of defence matters within the SNP in sweeping the General's terror. I know that some people have worked in defence industries, and I know other people have had sort of passing acquaintances with defence issues, but there's no one, no public figure that I know who can speak with confidence about defence issues. And I would say that's probably been the case since, without flattering him too much, since Angus Robertson no longer had his seat up in Mauritius, because he was quite clued up. And I wouldn't want to denigrate the efforts of Stuart MacDonald or Martin Docherty Hughes, because I speak to them occasionally, and they've got interesting views, and I support some of the stuff that they write, and other bits that I don't support, they disagree with me. And Stuart MacDonald famously said on camera, when he was asked about something I'd written, his reply was, "Stuart Crawford has some good ideas, and sometimes he has some not so good ideas," which my children thought was the funniest thing they'd ever heard. So there's no expertise in defence issues generally within the SNP party, and probably not either within the Yes movement as a whole. And in terms of political opposition, defence is always has been, as far as I can remember, seen as the Scottish National Party's Achilles heel, because they're not confident about it. That's why they don't speak about it. And I'm not saying that you have to have been in the forces to be able to have an opinion or to speak competently about defence, but it does help, and it does help you with your credibility. But I just think they're not very bold about it. And I mean, for example, what is the current SNP defence policy? Where is it written? And the answer is it's 3 paragraphs in the 2014 white paper, and that's it. I mean, I think when you come to debate at any length defence issues as they might be in an independent Scotland, then all roads eventually lead to Faslane, because that's the elephant in the room, and always is and always has been until eventually it will go. I mean, my position on nuclear weapons is quite clear. I'm a unilateralist. I think that, and I'm sort of pragmatic about it, as well as being sort of ethical about it. I mean, from a moral and ethical point of view, I think they are, as most other people think, a dreadful invention, which sadly can't be uninvented. But from a military point of view, I think they're unusable. I don't think they'll ever be used, because the consequences of using them will be so dreadful that it's a false threat. Actually, everybody's bluffing everybody else, but I don't think it will ever happen. On the other hand, the UK position and all the other political parties' position, I think, including the Liberal Democrats, is that Britain's nuclear deterrent should be sustained. So we are where we are. We've got Faslane. We've got 4 new boats being developed at vast expense, which could, of course, be spent on lots and lots of other things. And I don't just mean better conventional defence stuff. I mean everything that needs to be sorted. But that's not the decision that the government of the day, or the government of the days for decades, has made, of all political hues. So I think we have to accept that we've got nuclear weapons, and there is and I understand, because the SNP in particular has got quite a broad background base, which came out of the CND movement in the 1960s, a movement which I would support. And so the very thought that if Scotland becomes independent on the Friday, that Trident isn't out of the Clyde by the Saturday morning is anathema. But it just ain't going to happen, in my opinion. And I mean, there are other people in Scotland who are much better at talking about the nuclear deterrent and matters Trident than I am. And I direct you to Professor William Walker at St Andrews University, because basically what he says, I say. He says it better than me. And So I've been trying to think of ways that this can sort of be managed if Scotland becomes independent and we don't want nuclear weapons. How are we going to do this? The big problem is, as far as I can see, there's nowhere else for them to go in the short to medium term. I'm not saying long term, the short to medium term. And therefore, some sort of pragmatic arrangement has to be arrived at, because we're not talking about the process. That's not the important thing. It's the purpose. It's actually achieving the end. So we're looking at ways and means here. And it struck me that in the early days of an independent Scotland, if you accept the sort of economic case made in Andrew Wilson's Growth Commission report, that there will be about 15 years of austerity before everything sorts. If you accept that, which I do roughly, I mean, I don't know Andrew terribly well, but I have spoken to him a couple of times. Then we should, I think, be looking at how can we best afford to do the things that we need to do. And it just struck me that with Faslane, which is the controversial one, but also with Lossiemouth, the air station up in Morayshire, there is a case to be made of actually renting those or leasing them to people who would like to have that presence over a period of time. I'm not saying forever, I'm just saying in the short to medium term. I wrote my first attempt at writing about how an independent Scotland might defend itself and organise its armed forces. I actually wrote at the same time as I was doing my Defence Fellowship at Glasgow University. Now, my tutor at Glasgow University was head of the Scottish Centre for War Studies, a chap called Hugh Strawn, now Professor Sir Hugh Strawn, and a fairly renowned historian. And he was my tutor for the first part of my study, which was historical. And I was writing this thing on race relations, but in parallel with that, I was also writing at home in my bedroom after the kids had gone to sleep. I was writing this thing about how Scotland might defend itself. So I wrote it and I finished it, and I gave it to Hugh and I said, Hugh, what do you think of this? And he came back and said, I think we should publish this as the first occasion in a series of occasional papers from the Scottish Centre for War Studies at Glasgow University. And I was very flattered. I said, but we can't do this because I'm a serving army officer, and to publish anything, strictly speaking, according to Queen's regulations, I should go through the whole sort of clearance through the MOD PR thing. And I thought, they'll just not. It won't happen. I said, however, we could publish it under a nom de plume. And so he said, right, okay, done. So it was published under my maternal grandfather's name, Jack Hawthorne. And if you look it up, it caused an enormous fuss because the Labour Party found out that it was me. I was the author. And then the army found out that it was me, etc., etc. But that was my first attempt. And I rewrote that in 2012 in the report which became All the Blue Bonnets. But the important aspect of the Blue Bonnets was that my friend and colleague Richard Marsh, who's an economist, who actually worked on the Growth Commission panel and as an advisor to the Scottish Government, did some costings for me. So it became the first costed report on how an independent Scotland. And I'd met a guy called Malcolm Chalmers, who is now, I think, Professor Malcolm Chalmers, who works at the Royal United Services Institute. And I can't remember where I met him somewhere, but I met him somewhere. And I got onto a nodding acquaintance with him. And I sent him this rewritten Jack Hawthorne report, if you like, with costings added. And he said, oh, Russie will publish that. And I thought, well, that's all right. People know about them. So Russie published it, which I was really, really quite pleased and flattered with. And that was 2012. And of course, the two most recent iterations have been something which we revised in a very short paper. Richard Marsh and I revised the Blue Bonnets paper because we realised that the world had moved on, and we came up with a new model. I thought the Blue Bonnets model was too army heavy for the modern context, so we sort of stripped it out, and we came up with a sort of revision, if you like, very short revision, which actually, in actual fact, you'd have to read in conjunction with the original paper for it to make any sense, really. But that brought the budget down quite dramatically. So it brought it down from between 1.5 and 1.8 billion, which was our original estimate, down to between 1.1 and 1.3, which is becoming more and more affordable. And so we did that, and everyone's the usual commentary. And then just recently, I said to Richard, if you accept the argument that an independent Scotland initially, in the early years, could have a defence budget of 1.1 to 1.3 billion, and that would be acceptable, although it's way below the NATO 2%, and it's way below Andrew Wilson's, I think he went for 2.6% in the Growth Commission report. I said, but if we accept that is a viable option, then maybe we could actually envisage circumstances within this defence context where in actual fact Scotland could get its defence for free. Because if you, going back to my original comments about leasing out Faslane and such, if you could put costings onto how leasing out of Faslane and leasing out of Lossiemouth, what they might generate in revenue, and you put that against this putative defence budget that we've come up with, this reduced thing, the figures are pretty equal. So in actual fact, you could argue that Scotland can have its defence for nothing. Now, I mean, again, well, the SNP jumped all over the idea of leasing out Faslane, but that's publicly. I'm not quite sure what they're saying internally. And I've done a couple of talks to SNP branches around the country, I think in Airdrie and Falkirk. And of course, when I get to the bit about leasing out Faslane for 10 years, say, just to revenue for 10 years, because I always put a time limit on it. I can tell the minute I start there, everyone starts shaking their heads, and there's intakes of people shouting no, 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 and I always have to say stop, just listen, I'm not saying it's right, I'm just saying it's an idea. And then I find out that after I've left at 8:30 or 9, they've been there till midnight, discussing it. So that was a good sign.